To everyone that spoke before me. So I'm here as a member of FIST, but I'm actually going to speak a little bit more about some other things I'm involved in, because I was thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, and there's one issue I kept coming back to. I kept thinking about how we had a FIST conference a few weekends ago, which was fantastic. And one of the things we kept talking about was how things like sexism, racism, prejudice against people with disabilities, and LGBTQ people is a way to divide us. It prevents us from uniting in struggle. And I felt like that theme was coming up again at International Working Women's Day, that we need to move past these artificial differences and work through our divisions in order to unify in revolutionary struggle. And so I was trying to think about how do we start to address these divisions. And I think that one of the ways we can do that is just by talking about issues that make us uncomfortable, that are hard to have open, honest conversations about. So today I wanted to talk about an issue that I found to be very divisive in all sorts of activist circles, including feminist groups and socialist groups, and that issue is sex work. So this is a really complex and emotional subject, and I certainly don't think I'll be able to cover all the issues today, but I do hope it will be the start of a larger conversation. There are two main reasons I wanted to talk about sex work today. The first is that I've been working in the sex trade for about 7 months now, and thank you. And I wanted to share how my experiences have led me to believe that we must actively include sex workers in revolutionary struggle, and in particular why we need to understand how sex workers' struggles relate to the struggles of all workers. And I also just feel that often when the sex trade is brought up, it's presented as singularly oppressive, bad, or somehow worse than other work, or that only sex trafficking is addressed. There are a couple things I wanted to clarify before I start. The first is that I definitely don't claim to speak for all sex workers. There are vastly varying experiences. For instance, I've pretty much only done indoor sex work, which is very different from being out in the streets. I want to acknowledge that sex work is not solely a women's issue, though it's often framed that way. There are many men and people who identify with other genders who work in the sex trade, and I also wanted to be clear that I don't want to in any way diminish the violence and horror of the sex trafficking industry, just as I would never want to diminish the violence of other forms of labor trafficking, to farming, domestic labor, restaurants, and sweatshops. But I do want to be very clear that the majority of the people working in the sex trade are not trafficked, and we need to address their rights as well, and that only addressing this issue through a sex trafficking perspective, or by saying we must eliminate all sex work, is actually damaging both to people like me who chose to work in the industry and to people who have been trafficked. An activist sex worker in Mexico City once said something to me that I strongly agree with and that I've heard echoed by other sex workers. To paraphrase, she said, "People come here trying to save sex workers and they think we're so oppressed. I look at them and I say, I have friends who are working 60 hours a week at Walmart. They make minimum wage, they have their wages stolen, they don't get paid overtime, they are constantly struggling to survive. How is it that I need to be saved, that I'm oppressed, and they're not? I've made the best choice I could to support myself and my family, and that all workers are oppressed under capitalism." And I think this is a really critical point to understand, that it's not explicit coercion or trafficking, but economic circumstance that leads people towards sex work. Just as economic circumstance leads people to minimum wage jobs with no benefits because they're trying to make ends meet. A common model used to explain sex work, though I think it can be applied to any form of labor under capitalism, is that there's a spectrum of how people come to be involved in the industry. On one end you have choice, on the other end you have coercion, somewhere in the middle you have circumstance. I became involved in indoor sex work because I needed employment quickly and didn't have time to find a real job. I quickly realized that I could make more money and be more financially secure in the sex industry than if I were waitressing. So for me it was somewhere between choice and circumstance. The Sex Worker Project conducted a survey of indoor sex workers in New York City, and this sentiment was reflected. About 67% of respondents got involved with sex work because they were unable to find other work with a livable wage. Similarly, sex workers who were immigrants without work permits expressed that sex work seemed like the most viable economic option for them. So we can see that sex work is closely tied to other economic struggles, and it's not simply a case of women being taken advantage of by men, which is often how it's presented. There are other connections as well. For instance, it's estimated that about 87% of outdoor sex workers in New York City are homeless or in unstable housing situations and could become homeless at any time. But when we fight against sex work, we don't solve the problem of homelessness. All we do is make it more difficult for homeless sex workers to survive. Addressing issues like homelessness and raising the minimum wage through revolutionary struggle is significantly more likely to help improve these workers' lives than making it harder for them to go to work. And sex work is work. We need to support sex workers' rights just as we support the rights of all workers. We need to think about the ways in which we can integrate the fight for sex workers' rights into our struggles for the rights of low-wage workers and unemployed people. Think about this. Because so much sex work is illegal, you can be arrested and criminalized just for going to work. Because so much sex work is illegal, we have no way of organizing a union to fight for our rights. We have no right to unemployment benefits. There is no workers' compensation if you're injured on the job, which is very likely impossible to happen because about 46% of indoor sex workers and 80% of outdoor sex workers report experience violence while you are working. Yet because sex work is considered illegal, there's like basically no way to get legal recourse for this. At best, police will ignore your complaints, and at worst, they will turn around and inflict more violence on you. So it's a situation that there allows for a lot of exploitation and oppression. And this situation is also bad for people who've been trafficked because the raids that are supposedly meant to save trafficking victims usually just result in mass arrests, irregardless of whether you were trafficked or not. And then because the legal process of proving that you were trafficked is so complicated, even if you report being trafficked, you have to fear police violence and being arrested and jailed on prostitution charges. So fighting for sex workers' rights is human rights and working towards the decriminalization of sex work. Thank you. Fighting for those things, it will benefit both people who have been trafficked and workers who have chosen the sex trade to support themselves and their families. I just really believe it's so critical to incorporate the fight for sex workers' rights into our other struggles and to begin to view sex work as a labor issue rather than a form of sexual exploitation. I think we need to create revolutionary spaces where sex workers do not fear or feel ashamed to talk about their experiences. I was thinking before I came here today, like, what does it mean that I'm like so afraid to admit that I'm a sex worker in front of this room of people who are like my friends and comrades? Yet I still feel that fear. And yes, in large part it is social conditioning, but I know from previous experiences that even in activist circles I can almost certainly expect that some of you will think less of me because I said this or think I need to be safe. And I just think it's so important to be very clear and open and welcoming to sex workers in our revolutionary spaces so that we don't feel that way. So we need to create the revolutionary struggle that's free from those prejudices. Sex workers are strong. Sex workers have been fighting for their rights for years. They've always been part of revolutionary struggle, and we need to acknowledge and honor that history. As I see it, the best way we can honor that struggle is to take up the fight for sex workers' rights and to join it with the fights for the rights of all workers so that we can overcome this arbitrary division and move forward and struggle together. Wow. Note about the idea of criminalizing people who pay for sex, just in that it's actually quite a bad idea because even though it's often proposed as a solution, it forces things more underground and actually makes screening processes and things like blacklists much more difficult to maintain, and so it actually makes things much more dangerous for workers when it's criminalized on the side of like people who are paying for sex. So I think rather than looking at criminalizing anyone, we need to really look at like decriminalization overall rather than criminalizing one side or the other and arguing about that. But more so than that, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for all the like love and support. So yeah, thank you so much.